I'm most pleased to welcome you all to this launching of a new edition of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, first published some 50 years ago. In my mind, it is without question Hayek's most important work, in which he attempts to lay bare the foundations of a free and open society. The reception that Hayek's book originally received, to the extent that it was even acknowledged by the scholarly community, was often hostile and, at best, lukewarm. And this was a source of some disappointment to Hayek, who had invested so much effort and time in writing. However, over the years, its reputation as an important treatise has grown to the point where today no serious study of the criteria for a free society can avoid dealing with Hayek's claims. I first read the Constitution of Liberty when it was originally published in the summer before I entered graduate school at the University of Chicago to study under Hayek. While I was terribly impressed by the enormous erudition that the book displayed, I remember being disappointed with Hayek's notion of how extensive the actions of government could be and actually remain consistent with our understanding of what a free society is. My view was hardly original and remains consistent with, hardly original and reflected what turned out to be a fairly common criticism of Hayek's theory. The distinction in perspective, it turns out, was largely the result of the difference in how Hayek conceived the nature of rights. Like Hume, the intellectual whom Hayek most admired, Hayek rejected any conception of natural rights, that is, rights that adhere to all men at all times, in all circumstances, in favor of the notion that rights are prescriptive and are the result of an evolutionary process that reflects the peculiar history of any society. While my disappointment in his conception of freedom remains, I'm now far more sympathetic to the reasons why he envisaged rights as taking their form through historical development as one of many instances of spontaneous order. Indeed, I regard Hayek's theory of spontaneous order as his most important contribution to social philosophy and one of the seminal ideas in social theory. And in none of his writings does he discuss this theory in its political dimensions in more detail than in the Constitution of Liberty. To discuss this book, we're privileged to have with us this afternoon three people who are intimately familiar with Hayek's work: Professor Bruce Caldwell, Mr. George Soros, and Professor Richard Epstein. Our first speaker is Bruce Caldwell, currently professor of economics at Duke University and director of the Center for the History of Political Economy. He's the general editor of Hayek's Collected Works, of which this new edition of the Constitution of Liberty is the latest volume published. Caldwell himself has edited 4 of Hayek's most important works in the series. Did I get that right, 4?
I think that's right.
Among them, new editions of The Road to Serfdom and The Counter-Revolution of Science. He's also the author of an important study of Hayek's thought, Hayek's challenge, and intellectual biography. All of us who appreciate Hayek's contribution to the economic and social sciences owe a debt to Professor Caldwell for having undertaken the editorship of the Collected Works.
Well, Ronald, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how Hayek came to write the Constitution of Liberty, but I want to first recognize Ronald as the editor of this magnificent volume. I felt that the Collected Works was very fortunate to be able to get someone who was on the scene when Hayek published the book, and indeed Ronald didn't mention, but he wrote he was the book review editor of the New Individualist Review, and Volume 1 number one in April 1961 contained his critique of Hayek's views. And Hayek actually wrote a response. And to give you an idea, I mean, Ronald was very modest in his portrayal of his own views, but the response that Hayek wrote was the only, to my knowledge, review or response to something that someone wrote that he published later in his own collections of works. It was published in Studies in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics in 1967. So I found the exact right person for the job. And I will just also, for those of you who know the Constitution of Liberty, one of the big differences between this volume and the original volume is that instead of having endnotes, they're formulated as footnotes. So you can actually just look down at the bottom of the page and see everything that Hayek was saying. And believe me, you could read the endnotes as a volume in itself in the old edition. Well, now you have that stuff right down at the bottom of the page. It's a magnificent volume, and I thank you for your contributions. So it's a little hard looking at the archival record to figure out exactly when Hayek decided to write the Constitution of Liberty. There are a few hints. I will mention a few of these and then offer a conjecture as to how he came to write it. The one hint that we have is a letter to Fritz Machlup in November of 1953 when he says, "I'm beginning to have definite plans for that positive complement to the road to serfdom, which people have so long been asking me to do." So, I mean, the mind reels. Who are the people? Maybe it's people in the Mont Pelerin Society. That's one possibility. Another possibility would be people like Alvin Hansen and John Maynard Keynes, both of whom Hansen wrote a review in The Atlantic of The Road to Serfdom, where he said that Hayek talks about good planning and bad planning, but doesn't tell us how to distinguish the two. Keynes, in his famous letter to Hayek that he wrote on his way to Bretton Woods, said, "You admit here and there that it is a question of knowing where to draw the line. You agree that the line has to be drawn somewhere and that the logical extreme is not possible, but you give us no guidance whatever about where to draw it." So it may well be that he was responding, at least as a proximate cause, to some of these criticisms that said, well, okay, you've written a great critique of central planning in The Road to Serfdom, but what is your preferred society? What would be the preferred setup? If that's the proximate cause, I think, though, that this actually is a book that is the logical conclusion of a project that Hayek started as long back as 1937, that he started writing in 1939, but never finished. He called this project the Abuse and Decline of Reason Project. It was his war effort. He worked on it diligently through about the middle of the war, and it was to be 2 volumes. In the first volume, he was going to trace the spread of 2 ideas that he thought were bad ideas, socialism and scientism, and how they grew up together, moved from France to Germany to England to the United States, obviously taking very different forms in each one of these countries. Each had its own indigenous form, but the enthusiasm for scientific planning of society, the idea, scientism might be called the engineering mentality, the idea that you can socially engineer society in the same way that engineers design and build bridges, was something that was a dangerous set of ideas that grew up through time. The second volume in this 2-volume work was to show the results of this movement, and this was to be based on the sort of ideas that are contained in The Road to Serfdom. About halfway through the war, he said, well, I don't have to write this big 2-volume book. I'm becoming more concerned about the sort of political setup that we'll be facing after the war is over, so perhaps I should offer my warning in The Road to Serfdom, and he worked exclusively on that, never finishing the Abuse of Reason project. However, he did publish bits and pieces of it. One is his famous scientism essay. Another is 6 chapters from that talking about the French developments in the counter-revolution of science. But most importantly, an essay called Individualism, True and False. Now, this essay was to have been the very opening essay of the Abuse of Reason project. And the reason that I trace back the Constitution of Liberty to Individualism, True and False is that if you read them together, you'll see many of the important themes in the Constitution of Liberty expressed in Individualism, True and False. One of the ideas is the profound difference between the Enlightenment as it took place in Scotland